This is part of the future. I think Canadians need to recognize that part of Prime Minister Carney's vision for this country, unfortunately, involves mass layoffs across multiple industries. And this isn't the first time we've seen this happen. Stellantis was given tens of billions of dollars.
Then came the explanations, and from that point, the issue moved beyond being merely troubling and became far more serious. Prime Minister Mark Carney and the Ontario provincial government both repeated the same line of argument: either preserve 2/3 of the business or lose it entirely. On the surface, this framing sounds firm and pragmatic, but when placed in its real-world context, it gives the impression that thousands of workers were implicitly treated as acceptable losses, and even reminded that they should feel fortunate the number was not higher.
Across in BC, in Nova Scotia, have been shutting down left, right, and center. Prime Minister Carney and his cabinet, unfortunately, won't tell you that this is what the result of their inaction is going to lead to. But we are seeing now, increasingly, that it's just leading to job losses.
That is precisely why the message almost collapsed the moment it was delivered. When leaders say that 2/3 have been preserved, workers can only see that 1/3 was deliberately cut. When politicians frame layoffs as a sign of success, families experience it as a cold calculation in which spreadsheet figures are placed above the wages that sustain their lives. This was not an unexpected market shock or an emergency shutdown. It was a transition planned in advance, consciously approved, justified after the fact, and communicated as though it were unavoidable.
The Premier of Ontario, we had a choice. We had a choice. Save 2/3 of the jobs or let the company go down. We chose the future. We chose the future for Algoma Steel so they can invest in the future.
Prime Minister Carney, but we need to remember that we are in a tariff war against an economy that is 13 times our size. They were our largest trading partner, and now they're tariffing us to the tune of 50% for steel.
What ultimately drains this argument of its force is the fact that the prospect of losing everything was never convincingly demonstrated. No alternative options were presented to the public. No transparent analysis was offered to explain why the number of layoffs could not be reduced, and there was no clear answer as to why workers were the first to bear the losses. In the absence of those foundations, the message ceases to be a realistic assessment and instead becomes a form of implicit pressure. Accept it, or be blamed for even worse consequences.
Prime Minister Carney ran an entire campaign predicated on the fact that only he could deliver the results for Canadians when it came to dealing with President Trump. And he set his own deadline to July 21st. It's December, and all we have seen are job losses.
And once that framing is accepted, the entire discussion shifts course. The focus is no longer on steel tariffs or the mechanics of industrial transition. Instead, it raises a larger question: whether the current approach to governance is merely about managing economic decline, while expecting Canadians to stand on the sidelines and applaud as conditions steadily worsen.
That's not to say that we are not going to experience pain, and I don't think Canadians expect us that we won't feel pain. We will take hits. This is the US. They are our largest trading partner, and they are attacking us in a lot of ways. So we need to be expecting these. I think to date, Canadians have been pretty patient with Carney's approach to wait out taking a bad deal.
What leaves the deepest damage is the sense that all of this was known in advance. Exchanges in Parliament, along with admissions from the provinces, have led many Canadians to the same conclusion. The consequences appeared to have been anticipated even before the funds were fully dispersed. When the public believes that the pain was foreseen but not stated plainly, every explanation offered afterward sounds as though it had been prearranged. At that point, the so-called vision no longer inspires confidence, but gradually turns into suspicion, and that suspicion spreads far beyond the scope of any single plan.
Hundreds of everyday household items are about to get a lot more expensive thanks to President Trump's trade war and specifically the steel and aluminum tariffs. The tariffs were initially only expected to hit raw materials, but now they include goods containing steel and aluminum.
The government then turned to its familiar shield, the trade war. The United States imposed tariffs of up to 50% on Canadian steel, and Ottawa portrayed everything that followed as the inevitable consequence of an economic confrontation with a partner 13 times larger. In theory, this explanation sounds like a full-scale national crisis. In practice, however, the argument feels rather convenient. especially when it is deployed only after the burden and the damage have already been shifted onto workers.
When it comes to Canadian steel, more than 90% of exports go to the U.S. Ontario is the hub, home to half of Canada's steel plants. Billions of dollars in trade now in jeopardy, staring down the barrel of 25% U.S. tariffs.
They will be devastating, but challenging on both sides of the border, in fact, not just on Canada.
The cold reality reflected in the numbers is clear. For years, roughly 90% of Canada's steel exports have depended on the U.S. market, meaning the industry has long been in a fragile position, not only since tariffs were raised. When that relationship began to falter, the shock did not reach boardrooms or centers of power. Instead, the impact landed squarely in workers' paychecks. The response was not to move quickly to find new markets or introduce emergency measures to protect incomes, but to proceed with restructuring, electrification, and workforce reductions along a roadmap that had been prepared months in advance.
But I think we'd be naive not to expect that we will feel this pain, and of course, my compassion and my heart does go out to those experiencing these layoffs. And the hope is that we don't experience further ones, but I think the likelihood is that that may come.
It is precisely at this point that the story reveals its true depth. A country that built its industrial base on excessive dependence is now being forced to pay the price for that choice. And once again, it is workers who bear the burden first. Tariffs do more than drive up costs. They expose years of neglect in long-term strategy, where market diversification was often talked about, but rarely carried through in any meaningful way. When the pressure finally mounted, there was nothing left to fall back on.
You're talking about 1,000 people who are about to hit the EI rolls 3 weeks before Christmas, and he's there essentially as a cheerleader for macroeconomic things that he likes, and kind of totally lacked empathy, and I kind of really thought missed the moment, and kind of showed himself to be quite out of touch with the frontline realities of what's going on in the trade war.
So when Canadians are told that the tariff war has made everything inevitable, what they actually feel is that the country waited too long to prepare, and that the price is now being passed on to others. That is why the wave of anger has not subsided, because this moment is not simply the result of external pressure. It feels more like a belated reckoning for delayed decisions, risks that were once ignored, and consequences that have ultimately fallen on the shoulders of those least able to bear them.
Sebastian's already pointed out he missed a self-imposed deadline of July, and I think it's increasingly clear that the Prime Minister would rather punt on making a deal than to rush a deal to say he has one and have it be a bad one that's going to have longer-term consequences. And I think where he's really kind of failed in this part of this first 9 months of his prime ministership is to actually lay out a coherent vision as to what we're working towards, acknowledge some of the trade-offs.
After the tariff-based justification was laid out, the presentation moved on to its next chapter. Concepts such as electrification, modernization, and improved competitiveness were introduced, with promises that the steel industry would move away from blast furnaces to electric arc furnaces, operations would become leaner, emissions would fall, and Canada would ultimately emerge stronger. On the slides, everything was arranged to sound perfectly logical, but in real life, this meant that thousands of paychecks were eliminated in advance, even before a single dollar of support had reached workers.
There's 1,000 jobs that are going to be lost. Is it temporarily lost? Are they going to be reskilled and brought back? What type of functions and programs are going to be put in place to support them in the meantime? Sault Ste. Marie is not a very big place where 1,000 jobs can be absorbed very quickly. So that message needed to be made clear. And I think that's where the fault should lie, is that they didn't roll it out as they could have.
The problem is that once the polished language is stripped away, the so-called vision ultimately promises a future with fewer jobs. The new positions being discussed are limited in number, slow to arrive, and burdened with conditions. The company itself has acknowledged that even if the new projects run smoothly, at most around 500 jobs could gradually be restored, meaning the workforce will never return to its previous level. This is not a transition designed for workers, but a long-term contraction disguised under the label of progress.
People come out carrying staples, but some say they're delaying payments from electric bills to credit cards to keep their families fed. And the data suggests it's an issue coast to coast.
It is precisely here that the political contradiction becomes most visible. The government speaks of long-term competitiveness, while families are forced to worry about immediate survival. Retraining cannot happen overnight. Building new plants or facilities takes years. But mortgage payments, rent, and grocery bills still have to be paid month after month. When policies are promised for a distant future while job losses happen immediately, people no longer feel they are part of that plan. They feel left out. What makes this anger more dangerous is the emotional void at the very center of the issue. As many people were bracing themselves for layoffs just weeks before Christmas, the country watched the Prime Minister respond like a consultant presenting a model. There were analyses, frameworks, and long-term arguments, but no real acknowledgement of the shock of losing one's livelihood at such a sensitive moment. When leadership speaks fluently about systems while remaining detached from the lived reality of ordinary people, the damage only spreads further. Canadians, in the end, do not hear reassurance. They feel distance. And at moments like this, that distance can quickly turn into resentment.
Costs for food is the worst offender right now, of course, 4.7 or 4.8%. But not only food, other basic essentials are going up. Rent has been going up. The cost of fuel, if you take out the temporary effect of the carbon tax, has been going up. So Canadians can't afford this government. And it's very simple. When you're creating cash faster than you're creating the stuff cash buys, you have inflation.
The frustration is spreading rapidly because this shock is not occurring in a vacuum. Everything feels heavier as the cost of living crisis has already been weighing on many families. Food prices remain stubbornly high, while rent continues to consume a large share of household income. For many, mortgage renewals have landed like an unexpected financial blow. The number of people turning to food banks has reached unprecedented levels, with a growing share still employed but unable to make ends meet. In such circumstances, even a small setback can trigger serious consequences. Today, losing a job means there is little safety cushion left. Savings are thin and options are limited. The idea of pain being only temporary becomes meaningless when there are no reserves left to get through it.
So Canadians can't afford this government. And it's very simple. When you're creating cash faster than you're creating the stuff cash buys, you have inflation. And that is one of the reasons why prices continue to rise. And for many people, rise faster than their incomes. It's why we have a record number of people lined up at food banks.
Canadians then looked to the budget in the hope of finding clarity. But what they received instead was a sense of confusion and contradiction. Massive spending commitments for the future collided with sharp cuts and a growing deficit, without a clear explanation of who would be asked to tighten their belts first. Grand visions that deliver no immediate impact quickly begin to feel hollow, while cuts that lack any sense of fairness leave many feeling directly targeted. When these two realities coexist, people stop searching for coherence and begin to suspect that they themselves are becoming the subject of an experiment. A budget is not just about allocating money, it reflects priorities, and right now, millions do not see themselves in those signals. Beneath it all, a deeper fracture is taking shape. The country is gradually being divided by different lived experiences, the story of major cities standing in contrast to the reality of industrial communities. Language oriented toward the future collides with the needs of the present. Ottawa increasingly appears to be speaking to investors, international forums, and policy circles, while many other regions feel they are being talked about rather than spoken with. A national vision only truly matters when people can see themselves in it. When that does not happen, cohesion begins to erode, and the resulting void is quickly filled with suspicion.
Adrian, Donald Trump declaring on social media that he's officially called off trade talks with Canada.
The center of tension is now shifting toward Washington. The Prime Minister is entering a phase of engagement with the U.S. President at a moment when trade pressures have yet to be resolved and domestic trust has already been damaged. Every meeting will be scrutinized down to the smallest detail, and every image released risks being turned into a political weapon. This moment carries heavy expectations. People want to see concrete action, a sense of urgency, and firmness displayed openly. Symbolic gestures are no longer enough. As families struggle to get by, they want the pressure pushed onto negotiation tables elsewhere, not quietly absorbed at home.
And Canadians will be forced to spend an extra $1,000 next year on groceries for a total of $17,600, an almost unbelievable amount of money, an amount that is doubled under the Liberal government. It is true that that inflation is too high across the board. Food is worse. Now, why is inflation high across the board? Because the government is running a $78 billion deficit. They're creating more cash. That bids up the price of goods. Why is food worse? Because on top of the monetary inflation of printing money, you've got a bunch of extra hidden taxes.
And for that very reason, this story cannot simply end here. Canadians do not believe that everything will stop with the steel dispute, and almost no one thinks it will. They are seeing a familiar pattern gradually take shape. Talk of transition comes first, consequences follow, and only then do the explanations arrive. Today it is one sector, tomorrow another. The script